Hello, everybody, and welcome to another great episode of My EdTech Life. Thank you so much for joining us on this wonderful day, and wherever you are joining us from around the world, thank you as always for all of your support. We appreciate all the likes, the shares, the follows. Thank you so much for engaging with our content, and thank you so much for your wonderful feedback, as that helps us continue to bring you some amazing conversations that will continue to help us grow in the education space. And today I am really excited to welcome a two-time guest and a first-time guest. When we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is amplifying creativity. And these gentlemen have written a book, and I'll let them tell you a little bit more about that. But I would love to welcome to the show Zachary Stier and Tom Rendon. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having us.
Great. Thank
Awesome.
you. Thank you, Fonz. Appreciate being on the show.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And like I said, Zachary being a two-time guest, and one of the things that I do want to reiterate to to anybody listening, or to previous guests, if you're listening to this, when I tell you, like, hey guys, once you're a guest of My EdTech Life, you're always welcome back. This is an example of that. Like I mentioned, Zachary, he's a two-time guest, and today he's going to be talking about this wonderful project that him and Tom have been working on. But before we get into the meat of the project, for those of you that are listening and are not familiar with Zachary's and Tom's work just yet, I'm going to go ahead and let them introduce themselves and give you a little bit of context of what they're doing in the education space. So we'll start with Zachary. Zachary, can you give us a little introduction?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for letting me be on as a guest. And my background has been for well over a decade in public libraries, and that's the space that I am really excited and continue to be excited in bringing forth how we look at learning and creativity within informal learning spaces such as public libraries. So it's that's part of what I do. Obviously, I'm an author and I do teach some courses at the University of Illinois in the School of Library and Information Science.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Zachary. And Tom, now to you, our first time guest. Give us a little brief introduction and what your context is within the education space.
Great. Thank you, Fonz, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm an author and a consultant, and I've written a number of articles, resources, and now this is actually my second book. My first book was called Saving Play. So it was all about the importance of play in early childhood education. And that's really been the focus of a lot of my writing and work has been around early childhood education, particularly at the level of early childhood systems, governance, collaboration efforts, socio-emotional development, young children, that kind of thing. I'm also a consultant with two Head Start National technical assistance centers, the National Center for Health, Behavioral Health and Safety, and also the National Center for Parent, Family, Community Engagement. So that kind of keeps me also involved in things, but in that role, serving as a consultant
Excellent. Well, definitely you
on lots
both.
of subjects. So, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say both of you definitely keep very busy. And I know, Tom, I just met you recently, and Zachary, we were just having a conversation. And like I said, I really love the work that you all put out. And I'm really excited to talk about this. And especially you, Tom, right now that you hit on a couple of things there as far as the creativity and the play, in young children. So the title of the book is called Creativity in Young Children, which really goes straightforward and to the point. So I want to talk and I want to get started here with a couple of questions. So now you call this, what would be something like a journey in curiosity and about creativity. So I want to start with you, Tom. What was the initial spark about this topic in curiosity, creative play in young children and the collaboration? How did that come about?
Well, it actually started with Zach. So, I mean, he can fill in that part of the story, but I think he had this idea. I think some of it had come out of some research he had done, I believe, for his dissertation, and uh, and he kind of approached me and said, "Hey, why don't we do a presentation?" And this was right at the start of COVID, so we had an online presentation. We put it together. around creativity and sort of the role of creativity. And, you know, it was sort of our kind of us dipping our toe into it. But I think part of what made it an adventure was, and we even say this, the very first sentence of the book is, we should not be writing this book, which seems a little counterintuitive. And then we talk a little bit about why we went ahead and did it anyway. And I think the reason we did it anyway was really two driving forces. One was curiosity. Like, we really just wanted to know more about it. And then once we knew more, we kind of put that together and said, hey, maybe some of this would be worth sharing with other people. And the other part of it, I think, is, you know, is courage. Like, sometimes we're afraid to speak out because we don't feel like we know enough. We're not an expert enough. Or we look around us and say, well, this person knows much more than I do, or this person is a much better expert at this than I am. And yet, I think anytime anybody reappropriates or rethinks new ideas, they kind of make it their own. And that in fact, and this I think is the point I really want to underscore, is our process of writing the book was in fact a creative process. And in writing the book, we learned that much more about creativity, and then also put that into it. And that sort of snowballing effect is something we discovered throughout all of our research as we looked into creativity.
Excellent. Zachary, how about yourself? Can you fill in some of those gaps there, like Tom said, that, you know, as far as seeing this project come to fruition and obviously your own curiosity in the topic of creativity?
Yeah, and I don't know if Tom remembers this or not, but pre-COVID, he took me to a baseball game. And Tom and I had already, Tom and I already knew each other for quite a few years. But it was during that baseball game that I think we connected strongly on Mr. Rogers, on Fred Rogers. I had not known that about him and his connection to that world. And I don't know, it's a spark just happened. And I left that game thinking, we need to circle back to that conversation, especially with Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, because it is truly, there's many different themes in that neighborhood, but curiosity and creativity are two strong ones. But I'm also coming from this from a space of experience in how my own learning and having a learning disability, and wanting to ensure that we're honing in on that differentiated learning trajectory, that there are many ways to see the world and there are many ways to do things creatively. And so I wanted to be able to investigate that. And something I will also say that brings, I think, strength to the book for, Tom and I being co-authors is our different backgrounds, right? In that formal learning space and the informal learning space, how do we build that bridge together? Because learning and creativity is universal. It's not confined to a specific environment.
I love it. Well, this is great because it kind of gives me a little bit of insight as far as your perspectives and how both of you kind of came into this project, and kind of also at the same time, not only digging more into the topic and learning more about it, but through your own individual perspectives, also bringing that and your voice together. And I know Zachary and I, prior to recording, we are talking about that storytelling process and how we learn and how we share, the knowledge and the learning that we do. And I think that the way that I'm seeing you two connect here, your worlds, and bringing this together to create this book is really exciting. And I'm definitely looking forward to reading the book for sure. But I did get to see a little preview of the book. Thank you, Zachary, for sending me that link. But one thing that really caught my attention in that book too, as well as we kind of get into the core concepts here, is in the book you state that creativity is so critical to the way humans grow and learn that it should be at the center and not the periphery of early childhood education. So I'll start with you, Zach. Can you expand on why you believe that creativity deserves to be at the center of learning?
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, creativity, connects to a person's identity in that way. It's a discovery process to not only those aspects of learning, whether it be in a classroom, at the library, but also how, what their process is and how they're seeing the world and what narrative they want to share with that. I think it really creates a catalyst for a conversation, especially within that space when individuals may, I wouldn't necessarily say frustrated, but maybe they're confused as to why they may not be, connecting to a certain concept or a certain way on how to solve something or complete an activity. But when we take the time and initiative and we allow ourselves to listen to that narrative on how someone is seeing the world, how someone is able to, achieve whatever they're wanting to achieve, we begin to realize that that's their individuality, and we need to lean in on that. And yeah, that's how I, take that particular statement that you had just read.
Excellent. Tom, how about you?
Well, I guess just to build a little bit on what Zach's saying. I mean, I consider myself to have some amount of knowledge and expertise in the area of child development. And interestingly enough, I think the last chapter we wrote in the book is actually the second chapter, which is one which sort of unpacks child development from a perspective of creativity. And in fact, we go through some of the hallmarks of child development, particularly as articulated by Developmentally Appropriate Practices document from the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and then begin to talk about the connections we see between these hallmarks of child development and the hallmarks of and what we see as the connections with creativity and the creative process. And then we go back and look at a number of the pioneers of early childhood development theory. So people like Maria Montessori and John Dewey and Jean Piaget and Vygotsky and all these names which early childhood educators are very familiar with, and sort of looked at what did they say and how did what they said connect back to creativity. So that really, we said that really needs to be front and center. It needs to be in the beginning, because it really creates this foundation for the point that we made. And that, I hope that people hear that phrase really as an opening of a door to begin to rethink and re-explore. Because one of the things that we come around to in one of the later chapters is the whole idea that when people think about creativity in young children, and we saw this in a number of books that we looked at that were on that very subject of creativity in young children. And most of those books were focused on things like, art activities you can do with children and music or dance or, any kind of creative, like classical creative expression. And what we wanted to say is, no, actually creativity is much more fundamental than that. It connects to our consciousness, which means it connects to every way we are aware of the world around us and process that world around us. That's why it becomes so integral to child development. And I'll just make one last point. The book the title is Creativity in Young Children, but the subtitle is What Science Tells Us and Our Hearts Know. So it was about trying to connect both head and heart. And we think creativity does that. So it becomes a sort of unifying force that rather we think that, well, here are cognitive skills or here are social emotional skills. And well, actually creativity starts to connect all that stuff together. So it can become kind of a unifier. And I remember one of the lessons I learned really early on when I was studying child development is this sort of whole child notion that, the child doesn't come to us as a cognitive being or as an emotional being or as a behavioral being. It comes, all of that's together. It's only when we analyze or look at what a child is doing and try to categorize or try to understand it that we begin to pull it apart. But that pulling apart in some ways is unnatural. That's not the way the child experiences it. They're experiencing all this stuff together. There's no interaction that doesn't have an emotional content or a cognitive intellectual content. And so that's where creativity can become really key.
And if it's okay, I want to pick up on something here. One other chapter that we focused on was the work from Yuri Brafenbrenner, who, is famous for the ecological theory. But what's unique about that is it went through an evolution in he then created the bioecological model. And why that's unique within the context of creativity is connecting with what Tom is saying is that bio meaning life, the individual, and ecology meaning the environment, they equally have influence on an individual, and looking at things within the ecosystem in that model demonstrates that the child, let's say, is at the center, and then what's built around that child, and that bi-directional relationship, right, that everyone has a responsibility to ensure. And something that Tom and I found, which is really great, is the child also has significant influence, and we need to lean in on that as well.
Yeah, and that's something that's very important. That kind of brings to mind and into light a lot of the things, being in education for 18 years, I have seen education change even from the time that I was, coming up in grade school, where I felt that I had a little bit more opportunities to be creative while still learning. And then all of a sudden, you know, uh, as you get into high school and so on, I got into a lot of things as far as creativity, being in band and chess club and doing all of those things. Now, kind of seeing it from the inside, and being in education for 18 years now, one thing that I've noticed is that creativity kind of is no longer there. And I'm speaking here just for myself. And I don't know if you've experienced this in your state, but I know here we're very, state testing heavy. And so one thing that I do notice is that from about third grade to about ninth grade, actually, because that's when they stop taking their state tests, it just seems like there isn't a whole lot of opportunity that is given to a lot of students to really express their creativity, because it seems like everything is just curriculum, go go go, state testing practice, go go go. And we're losing a lot of those creative components and allowing students to be able to express themselves or even express their learning in a different way, or even discourse in classrooms. So I think myself too, I kind of fall in line with what you're saying, is being able to allow that creativity in the classroom can allow me as a teacher to know my students more and to play to their strengths and allow them to learn in a way that is still very creative, touches on their personal, I guess, modalities of the way that they like to express their learning. But as long as I get to see that there is content mastery, I'm completely okay with it, because that's the way that I would run my classroom. I would tell my students, here's a choice board. And this, I'm talking about maybe 10 years ago when I was last in the classroom. Here's a choice board. However, you love to share your learning with me in a creative way, here are your choices. And if there's something that isn't there that you'd like to share, just let me know and I'll be more than happy to let you do it that way. And it was just amazing how the students were so engaged. Even my absenteeism in my class was really low, because nobody wanted to miss class, because you allow for that creativity to be amplified. And I think that's something that is very, very important, that play, that discovery, that curiosity, which I was telling Zachary, growing up as English being my second language, I would sit there watching shows like Pinwheel, Mr. Rogers, Square One. I was watching Sesame Street and reading Rainbow, and a lot of those shows really inspired my creativity when I was little, and just being very curious about things. And I think that's something that's very important. Well, I want to ask you now, the way that you broke up this book, there is a specific section that I want to talk about, which is the 7 big ideas about creativity, which is part 2 of the book. So I know you've organized your research into these big ideas, and I'll start with you, Zachary. Could you share which of these ideas was most surprised you as you were doing your research for the book? And if you don't mind, before you answer that, I just for our audience members, because they may not have the book in hand yet, which we'll definitely
Yeah,
link
this one right here.
here, yeah, in that book, but we'll definitely link it in the show notes so everybody can get their copy. But your big ideas, number one is creativity as a life force. Number 2, the neuroscience of creativity. Number 3, creativity and neurodiversity. Number 4, creativity as curriculum. Number 5, creativity in formal and informal settings. Number 6, creativity and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And number 7, creativity and trauma. So, Zachary, as you wrote this book and doing the research here, which of these 7 big ideas just really just wowed you, or you kind of went in deep and found it just found something enlightening within it?
I knew you were going to ask a question that's going to be tricky, and I say tricky in a good way because there's several chapters that I truly enjoyed investing in. I'm gonna say this for today, where I'm at with this. It would have to be the last one for me, and that is creativity and trauma. Um, and the reason is I've invested some of my work as a children's librarian. Social work in libraries has become very prevalent in understanding, all of the challenges that individuals face, especially with their lived experiences and, let's say being unhoused or food insecurity and, some of transportation needs and the like. But diving into creativity and trauma and knowing that, based on those lived experiences and those challenges, that there is an impact there. I don't necessarily know if the word is stifle, but when individuals are faced with circumstances that, can leave lasting impacts and effects, for me, investing in that chapter was to really dive into not only the neuroscience of that, right, to see in that physiological piece, but again, I just go back to, the psychological lens and how that, can shift an individual's understanding of themselves, the belief in themselves, and that, trauma can have lasting effects, not only, based on some of those challenging areas of equity, but also, in their learning and development. And there was a lot of crossover in that chapter. And I was happy that we put that in the last chapter, because I was able to see a lot of connections, and that one of the strongest connections is what Tom alluded to, which is, head and heart as well. So that would be mine as of today, would be my one of the strongest chapters that I enjoyed investing in.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing. Tom, how about yourself?
Well, I'm like Zach. I'm going to say it's a little bit unfair question. It's like which of these is your favorite child?
Yeah.
As a parent. But I'm going to pick. But you also added the descriptor of which one surprised me the most, and I think the one that surprised me the most was the very first one, which is creativity as a life force, and I was actually in the process of writing the book. We interviewed about 6 different known experts in the subject of creativity, and we interviewed them, and I was actually kind of intrigued by this idea of the life force, and so I ran it by one of them, and he goes, "Oh, that's a bunch of nonsense," he said, and so I said, "Oh, okay." And I said, well, we'll have to be really careful with that one. But then the more I dug into it, the more I found that it actually explained a lot. And the other thing that I find, again, just kind of going back to this wider theme of writing the book was a creative. We took a creative approach to write a book about creativity, which is like, how else do you do it? But like so much in creativity, it was an accident that we really stumbled across this idea of the life force. I was doing some research into Piaget and beginning to try to figure out, like, well, what did he say about creativity? And because I was making the connection between creativity as the way in which we construct meaning and information and knowledge. Well, that's very much akin to constructivist theory, which, of course, Piaget was sort of that was very solidly in his contribution to the child development field. And so I was doing some research on it and discovered that actually Piaget's first area of study was biology. So he was a scientist, a biological scientist studying life forms. And one of his big, one of the books he really found quite influential was a book called Creative Evolution by Henri Bergson, who was a French philosopher around the 20th century. And this book was highly influential at the time. And in there, he posits this idea, Henri Bergson does, of what he calls, and I really like the French here, it's élan vital. So vital élan, and actually élan is an English word if you look it up, and it sort of means panache or flair. So I just sort of enjoyed thinking about all the, because I really love words and I love the connotations that come out of words. And so this idea of the élan vital and this vital energy force that connects directly with life itself. And part of what Henri Bergson was doing was he was criticizing people who had taken Darwin's idea of evolution and saying this is a mechanistic process, right? It just happens. Natural selection is a mechanistic process. And he goes, I don't think it works that way. Like it doesn't seem as mechanistic as you'd think it was. So he was actually trying to levy a critique in it. And while he doesn't go so far as to say, well, there must be some kind of divine creator behind all this, he kind of suggests that as a possible way to explain what's happening. But he breaks down exactly what happens during that evolutionary change. And what he says that makes it possible is this life force that's in us. And so then we really, in that chapter, really unpack that idea. And of course, he saw it as the key to what evolution really is about, which is creativity. It's about the emergence of new life through change. And as Zach was pointing out with our introduction of Yuri Bronfenbrenner, with the environment. The environment, in fact, plays a really, really critical role in all of that. And so part of what we talk about in the book then is what happens when if we think that children being creative is children's life force exhibiting itself. How does that change the way then that we might support children's learning or add to children's learning or be better teachers? And I think it really comes down to a lot of the things you were mentioning before about how we might need to reintroduce that, and some of the rote learning processes could get broken open by really thinking about this life force. That's why we thought it was so fundamental, because we then could allude to it in all the other big ideas. And so that's one of the reasons we need first.
Excellent. And that was great, Tom, that you mentioned that, because that was actually my next question, but you've already answered it, which is great, talking about life force. But I want to give Zachary a chance. Zachary, is there anything that you'd love to add to that? Because that was definitely one of my big particular ideas that I was intrigued by, as creativity as a life force. What was your experience through that research, and what surprised you about, your research in that chapter?
Yeah, one thing that I have always appreciated about co-authoring this book is being able to be introduced to new words and phrases and taking that immersive experience. So the whole piece on Elan Vital, it took me a while, because when you circle back with literature like that, you have to kind of sit back and immerse back in that time when, some of that language was obviously a little bit more, I wouldn't say advanced, but it's a little bit different. We don't talk necessarily like that as much anymore. But for me, why I believe that chapter needed to be first is it just again circles back to the individual, and that they have a driving force within them, and helping them to kind of discover that. And that's why I thought the foundational theorists that we included in that chapter were the right choices. And, there are others, obviously, but those definitely were catalysts in this area of learning. and really connecting that, and really helping to evolve the next chapters and figuring out how do we sort of connect each one to that life force. So that was really my journey, is to really, again, see that connection between all of them as we continue to evolve our book.
Nice. Well, what I love about the book, and just again, like I said, seeing just the chapters and a little bit of the preview, is just again, it for me, in reading what I read, it just seems very straightforward, very research based, but also practical in a lot of areas. And
Mhm.
I found myself just connecting with a lot of, what I read. Again, just because of my experience growing up as an only child, and having to be creative in a way. And like I know I've mentioned my story a lot of episodes. Growing up being a language broker for my parents, and obviously having to be very creative in learning quickly and learning how to translate, and just being able to navigate the space as an English language learner growing up that way, and helping my parents. You have to definitely, improvise, adapt, and overcome, through a lot of situations. And so as I was reading, what I'm available to see, and a lot of these chapters, I'm like, oh my gosh, like, I can relate to it. And then there's that connection, which kind of brings me to my next question, as far as the connection between creativity and both cognitive and socio-emotional learning. So I want to ask you, and I'll start off with you, Zach, because I know you talked a little bit about this too, and then we'll move over to Tom. So how exactly does nurturing creativity help develop these crucial areas, such as social emotional, that emotional, excuse me, let me rephrase that. He says, so you mentioned the connection between creativity and both cognitive and social emotional
Mhm.
learning. So my question is, how exactly does nurturing creativity help develop these other crucial areas?
I think what the big word that comes to my mind first is relationship, right? That we're not looking at each of those in separate silos. I mean, we have to be able to understand each of them individually, but the goal is that we want to create that bridge of a relationship. Going into this book, yes, we needed to ensure that we were focusing on, neurology, and, spending a great deal of time and working, helping the reader to understand the different parts of the brain, that chemistry, all of that. But what I also found exciting is to work in that space of social emotional learning. It is a space that I think needs more attention. And there are, a variety of frameworks that you can look at. But what is crucial in social emotional learning is you look at it within nurturing of self, nurturing with others, such as through play, which is something that I know Tom knows a lot about. It's something that we did focus on. And how do we also build social emotional capacity within our environment, within our community? And so it really is a blend again of those ecosystems, and as well as, our connection to neurological influence, cognitive influence, and how, children are able to operate and see the world around them.
Excellent. Tom.
Well, I want to, before I do, I want to just make a brief comment, because we're talking about growing up as a dual language learner, and what that meant. And I think it's actually directly connected with what we know about creativity as well. And that is that we know that dual language learners have greater cognitive flexibility, not least because they're switching back and forth between different languages. And it is exact what we discovered was, rather than there being, like, I think we sometimes have this idea in brain science, that people live in, like, oh, if I'm going to do something, well, certain part of my brain's going to light up, and if I do something else, so like I have a language part of my brain, and I have a memory part of my brain, and it's not that that's not true. But what they're finding is more important than the location of these things. It's the interconnectivity between them. So it's the flexibility. And they've actually done studies that show that people that have that, not to get too nerdy on you, but you have two sides of the hemisphere, right, of the brain. And in the middle is something called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum is really just a massive net of different nerve connections between the right and left hemisphere of the brain. And what they have found is that the smaller that is in terms of literal closeness, the more creative people are likely to be, because interaction and connectivity is apparently easier, faster, more fluid, more flexible. So I think that actually dual language learners ought to have a natural tendency. I'm not saying, I don't want to stereotype anyone in particular, because these are really, really broad, vague generalizations. But the fact remains that flexible minds actually encourage that kind of creativity. And when you were talking about your own background as a dual language learner, it made me think about its direct connection actually to creativity. Getting back to the question that you were asking, which was, how do we see creativity supporting cognitive development and supporting social emotional development? I think some of the same things that I just said can really relate that. And that is that cognitive development is really about the development of new ideas, the development, or as I was talking about before under sort of constructivist theory, the development, the construction of meaning and the construction of new knowledge. So the idea is that when I teach a child something, that child may receive what I said, but what ends up when you say, so what did you learn about ABC? Because I just taught that to you. It's not going to come back exactly the way you said it. It's going to be changed in a way. They're going to hear some parts more than other parts. They're going to emphasize some things more than others. So it's like, well, how can I give somebody something and then they give it back to me and it looks different? How's that happen? Well, that's because I was constructing it. I was creating knowledge from the information that you gave me. And if that's really the way we learn, which is we shouldn't just pay attention, as we often do as teachers. We pay attention to what's the content that I'm conveying to children. But it's what's the content coming out of children. And this, of course, I always remember, you're going to, more of my my word, love of word nerdiness coming out. But the word education comes from the verb educe, which we don't use very often. But to educe something is to draw it out. So education is not about what we put into children. It's about what we draw out of children. And so, and what we discovered is that there is no learning unless it's recreated and I'm generating it. So you were talking before about what I would consider multiple means of expression. Like maybe there are many ways. Like I can have a lesson on, the geography of Mexico, let's say. Well, I could write an essay about that. I could do a PowerPoint presentation. I could draw a map. I could make a video. I could, there are many ways I could express that. And in doing so, I'm actually really highlighting the creative and the constructing nature of my own learning. Well, how can I not be learning better and learning more when I do that? So that's the connection to cognitive. And I think the connection to socio-emotional that I find actually really, really important. And if I could just give an example from our current, what's currently going on now, is I think a lot of the failure in our politics is a failure of imagination. We can't conceive of how certain things fit together. And I'll just give you one quick example that I've been thinking about a lot. But if you follow the news as carefully as I do, there was a recent vote in Chuck Schumer, who's the minority head of the Senate. He voted with the Republicans to pass this. And anyway, there were a lot of Democrats who were really angry with him for going along with the Republicans because they're not happy with all the stuff that the Republicans are apparently supporting Trump, and people don't like that. I don't want to turn your show into a partisan thing, but I'm just saying, I'm just describing what's happening. I'm not saying anything more than that. Well, when they were asking Chuck Schumer, like, well, why did you do that? His response was, well, because within the context of lawmaking, we think we're giving them more control and we want to still retain control of it. But then when somebody asked Bernie Sanders as an example of somebody sort of outside of that frame, it's like, well, why would you be opposed to what Chuck Schumer's saying? And he said, because real power comes from the bottom up, it comes from the people. And that's where we're really going to get change. Well, regardless of whether the merits of those two different points of view, what struck me about Chuck Schumer's response was he did not have the imagination to think about where does power really come from. From his mind, I mean, if you're minority leader of the Senate, you think your power comes from being the minority leader of the Senate. But if you take a wider view, say, where does power really come from? Well, maybe power comes from the bottom up, from people getting together and organized people. So a lot of our solutions to different political problems, we think we have an answer. But I think the question we need to be asking is, what are we not thinking about? What can creativity tell us to make us more imaginative for new possibilities of how we interact, how we understand the world, how we design solutions to problems? So,
Love that. That's great. And you know, right now I'm still with not only that example, but just the word, you know, educe, and the way that you said it's drawing out the learning. And what we continually see, at least now, in my experience now in education, is the students are the consuming the learning, but they really aren't creating, or you know, being creators of that learning. So that really struck a chord with me that really resonates really loud. And I think that's going to be a great soundbite for sure that I definitely want to put out. But you know, and of course, going into the cognitive side of things, you know, it's just so important making those connections, like you mentioned, and being very imaginative in the way that you're learning, and even in the way that you present learning. And I think you also hit on a couple of things throughout the episode too, talking about, you know, a little bit of that imposter syndrome, maybe many times thinking, well, maybe that person knows more than me. Like, for example, I would, you know, say, well, you know, Zachary, Tom, they're a little bit more knowledgeable on creativity than I am. But at the same time, I come in with a different perspective too, as well. And sometimes I think that hinders a lot of the creativity for a lot of people, which is that imposter syndrome, which kind of brings me to one of my last questions here that I do want to ask. And just kind of maybe through your research and maybe in your own experience working with children and working with adults too as well, what are some ways that adults might accidentally be stifling children's creativity without them realizing it? And I'll start off with you, Zachary.
I'm smiling just because um I have such an amazing community, especially parents. You know, this week we had Clifford the Big Red Dog come and visit the library, and really seeing that excitement come to life, especially from an imagination where we're able to bring a character from a story to the library. But why I'm smiling too is when we, you know, complete, like, let's say a story time, and we go into like a craft activity or an art activity or that space for creativity, it's an interesting time for me as a librarian, as a researcher, to observe that interaction, because I'm always curious as to when, you know, what window of time occurs to where as an adult we want to take over and we want to control the creative experience. And I say that with all the love in my heart. I'm not saying anybody's at fault here, but there are times. I'll give you a prime example. I don't know why I decided one time to teach kids about camels. I don't know how that all came about, but we did a creative activity after the program where kids could, you know, kind of piece together a camel, so sort of a creative craft, if you will. And I observed this child putting the head where the feet should be and the feet where the head should be. And I was just having a good old time allowing that child to really experience that creativity, and being mindful that eventually we want to learn about, the top down, about how our bodies are put together, and that is important. But it was interesting to see the parent come immediately and say, we got to start over now. And I watched them, take it apart. And because they ripped a little bit of it and they threw that part in the garbage. And again, I want to be very clear, like, nobody's at fault. I never want to tell a parent how to parent, but we need to give grace and space for children to be spontaneous and go through that process and enjoy it as well, and limit our control at times. I mean, and that's something that we learned, in the process of our research, and especially with our application by going to different sites and stuff, is you do set the space up, right? You bring supplies in, or you bring puppets in, or whatever you're wanting them to do, but you're also giving them space to figure out that journey on how they want to enjoy that experience. So that to me is sort of a big lesson, is to let children be creative and to celebrate that, and to really be mindful of how much control you may want to have, because it's very easy for us as adults um, to want to redirect a child immediately. So
Excellent. Thank you, Zachary. How about you, Tom?
Well, I really want to just underscore something Zach said about control. I think, well, and thinking about teachers, I think teachers really like control, and they often feel like it's really important because classroom management is a big challenge for teachers. But I would say that the biggest obstacle to supporting children's creativity, or what maybe adults do that prevent creativity or stifle it in some way, is really not listening or paying attention to what children are saying and doing. I think we have to be able to listen to them, because one of the things we do, we think of it as a passive role, like I'm not doing it and just listening, but active listening and really paying attention. What you're doing is you're giving that person a gift of time and your own attention. I could be focused on many things, but no, I'm going to be focused on you and what you're saying, and how you're expressing yourself. And what I'm doing when I do that is I'm saying you're valuable. What you say is important. And I think that that's one of the best things we could do to encourage creativity in children, is to get them to value for themselves their own creative expressions and their own way of being creative. The other part of the control is, I kind of want to ask why do we feel control is so necessary? And I think one of the reasons we think that control is necessary is because we're afraid of what's going to happen when we lose control. And I think that if we don't allow for spontaneity and allow for things to happen and emerge, we're not going to be so creative. I think that, like, the sort of classic way teachers are often taught, you establish a lesson plan and you decide, well, here's what I'm going to give to the students, and here's what I'm going to say to the students, and here's the experiences I'm going to give to the students. And then you do that. And I would venture to say 95% of the time it never works out. Sometimes you have a 10-step process in your lesson plan, and you get to one, and that's it. That's as far as you get. And so we think, oh my God, what a failure I am. Like, I can't even do a simple lesson plan. What's wrong with me? And I want to flip that on its head and say, but you created an opportunity for stuff to happen. And then can you improvise in the context of that? And actually, we have a whole section in the book, really based on a wonderful book by Sawyer. I'm trying to remember
Keith.
his.
Keith.
Yeah, Keith Sawyer. Thank you. It's really great book. We talk about it in the book, but he talks a lot about the kind of drawing parallels between improvisational comedy and teaching, and how they can support each other. So, but in order to do that, I'm going to come back to something I said earlier. The two key ingredients we need in ourselves to be creative is curiosity and courageousness, the ability to put it out there and go, and students have the same thing. It's like, oh no, I better not raise my hand because my answer might be wrong. Well, if we can't do everything we can to eliminate that, whatever penalty there is associated with giving the wrong answer, because you are creating something, even creating something wrong will lead to creating something better, and so I just want to highlight those two pieces of courage and curiosity as sort of antidotes to that need to control.
And if I could finish on that question, something that I also was excited that we put in the book is daydreaming is a good thing. And to celebrate daydreaming, because I don't think I daydream a lot. And I think we underscore that value of daydreaming, because as Tom said, we want to be able to give them that space and to be courageous and knowing that dreaming like that allows for new creative avenues and opportunities.
Oh, I love that. One thing I also wanted to add, though, if you don't mind, and is for me, one of the biggest things in the classroom that really helped me out was not only my own personal curiosity with the subject matter. And again, maybe for me, it was very different, or maybe because I was hardwired that way, I guess, growing up. But for me, coming in from private sector into education, and so really not knowing or learning, I guess, how to teach. Really sparked my curiosity in my subject matter. But also, one of the things that I found was very useful was even just being vulnerable with your students and understanding that, hey, it's okay to not know everything. I may not have the answer right now or yet, but I can get that for you, and allowing them to also feel comfortable in the classroom to say, like, hey, although the answer might not be correct, but let's dissect what you did answer and how that does tie to getting you to the right answer. And I
Let's
think that
pay
really
attention to the
Yeah.
creation you made.
And
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
I think one thing that I also want to highlight, and sort of where I came from in my own experience with the disability, is helping children to eventually become their own creative advocate, right? How do we teach these skills to advocate for your creativity? And one way that happened to me was geometry. Somebody asked me to memorize all these proofs, and I'm like, this isn't working for me, but if you let me walk around this table, we'll get where we need to go. But because that individual, and I'm not going to call them out, did not lean in on that, did not support that, I failed geometry. And what it did in 11th grade is to really show value in making sure you're advocating for yourself. But we need to do that as early as possible. And advocacy really starts with us as adults, as Tom said, making sure that we're courageous enough to give them the space to do that.
Fonz, do you mind if I add just one more?
sure, go ahead.
Yeah, because and actually this is in the final chapter of the book. But one of the things that we really recommend is to think about yourself as a creative person. How are you creative? In what ways are you creative? We really want to just eschew the whole notion of, well, I'm not a creative, or those are the creative people. I'm like the non-creative people, or whatever we might. It's like we're all creative. And if you don't believe that, and there's no reason you should just because I'm saying that, but is like, think about your own life and how you've been creative. And we actually model in the last chapter, and I really love your word vulnerability, because I think both Zach and I were very vulnerable in that final chapter about sort of admitting to tough times in our lives, mistakes we've made, things that didn't work out well, and the role of creativity. So it was sort of created a creativity biography for ourselves, and using that as a basis to say, you know what, I did create that, and I created that, and I created that, and it's like I am a creative being. Like I got tangible evidence I can prove to myself that I'm a creative being. Well, when you can get to that point, then you can really teach children about that same process of discovering their own creativity. And it's not like they don't have creativity. That's why we call it creativity in young children. Not as if creativity is something we're going to is a skill we're going to give to children. They're already being creative. It just needs to be, as we've said repeatedly, brought out and nurtured, and you need to be the midwife to all of the creative processes. But starting with your own creative journey, and we kind of model that in the book, and then really encourage people to do this.
I love that. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been an amazing and enlightening conversation, and it's definitely filled my bucket, and especially talking about creativity, which is something that I know I've gone through a creative journey. And, a lot of the things that you've described is things that I have either felt or have experienced at some time, or I even had to adapt and overcome. But I thank you for this wonderful resource, and we will be linking it in the show notes. So for all our audience members, please make sure that you check out the show notes for creativity in young children, what science tells us and our hearts know. So make sure you pick that up. But before we wrap up, gentlemen, I always love to end the show with these last 3 questions. So we'll go ahead and alternate them. And I'll go ahead and start with you, Tom, since you're a first-time guest. So you get to answer this question first. So as we know, every superhero has a weakness or a pain point. Much like Superman, kryptonite was his weakness. So I want to ask you, Tom, in the current state of education, what would you say is your current kryptonite?
It'd have to be procrastination. It kills me. It destroys me, and it's probably the biggest stifler of my creative output. I don't generate as much things, whether it's things I write or things I say or what product, whatever I'm doing, ideas. If I procrastinate, so that's just sucks. Just like kryptonite, it just sucks all the energy out of me, and all I want to do is to curl up and stay in bed all day.
Hey, you know what? That is exactly the way that I feel. I think you and I are the same way. Like procrastination. Like I used to always say when I was going to college, I'd say, I procrastinate later. I'd be one of those like the night before doing 25-page research papers and everything. But now as I get older, I'm like, oh, this hurts. Like this really hurts now. And yeah, it's
Kind of
definitely
hurt back
difficult.
then too,
Yeah, it did hurt back then, but we were still young and we didn't feel it either. But now, oh, that hurts. All right, Zachary, on to you. I want to ask you, what would you say is your current kryptonite?
I struggle with this one, but I think mine is balance right now because I just want to seize every opportunity, and I don't know. I don't want to say the answer no, but I don't know how to find that balance and saying maybe not right now. And so then I just get really tired and I too want to go to bed, but trying to find that balance is my kryptonite right now.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, Zachary. All right, we'll start off with you now, Zachary. For question number 2,
Sure.
if you could have a billboard with anything on it, what would it be and why?
You and I were talking about this at the very beginning before we hopped on, and I've changed it. And I'm going to give credit where credit's due. But right now, in talking about this today and our creativity, I'm going to give our friend Fred Rogers another space. And he said, quote, you've made this day a special day, but just being you, there's no person in the whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are. And I think that pretty sums up the billboard I would like to have right now.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Zachary. How about you, Tom? What would your billboard say?
Well, what came to mind for me was actually something I saw. It wasn't quite on a billboard; it was on the side of a building, and it was the Science Center of Iowa, and it says, "Creativity is intelligence having fun." And I think that pulls together a lot of the things that we've been talking about today. That creativity is an expression of intelligence, and so therefore we can't think of intelligence just as like book knowledge or whatever. It's obviously something more than that. And if there's not an element of fun to it, I think we're somehow cutting it short and shortchanging ourselves. So that's something I really learned when I with the saving playbook. So I sometimes think maybe this book should be have been saving creativity.
Yeah.
Given what you were saying about how maybe it's gotten pushed out too much out of our educational processes today.
Yeah, definitely. Great answer, Tom. All right. And the last question. Now we'll start off with you, Tom. If you can trade places with one person for a single day, who would that person be and why?
Well, it's going to sound like Zach and I colluded on this, but we didn't. But I would say Mr. Rogers. If I could trade places with Mr. Rogers, I would want for a day. And the reason is because to me, what makes Mr. Rogers special and in, again, maybe this is the wrong vocabulary, but what I consider him a saint is his transparency. He's utterly who he is. He was always interviewed as like, well, you're this very nice man on television, but like, who are you really? And he's going, well, I'm who I am. I can't be anybody who I am. And when we can come to, if I can live out of that space to just say, I am who I am, and this is how I'm presenting myself today, without apology, without explanation, without regret, with courage to do that, as we've been talking about. That to me is real freedom.
Excellent, Tom. All right, great answer. I love it. All right, Zachary, how about yourself? Who would you trade places for with a day, or who would you trade places with for a day, and why?
Yeah, obviously Mr. Rogers, I gave him a spotlight for that billboard, but I'm gonna reel back to someone that probably doesn't have any aspects of being famous like Mr. Rogers, but I would definitely say my dad. You know, Seeing the world like what he did was very simple. He went day to day, living a very simple life, but it really helps me to connect to creativity because he was able to really operate in that space and figuring out ways to solve, you know, day-to-day problems or articulate things going fishing and seeing, the connection between nature and fish to the metaphor of life. I mean, I really appreciated that because I sometimes can take things a little bit more seriously than most, and it just provided a lot of ease into my life. And I think that that's significant when we look at creativity, is that there is simplicity, and it is a matter of pausing and reflecting and looking. And sometimes I don't think we do enough of that because we're in this space of, what's next and being busy, checking things off. And so that would be the best answer today for me.
Awesome, Zachary. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Zachary, Tom, you've been phenomenal. Thank you again and again. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you that are watching or listening, make sure you look for the book. The link is in the show notes. Creativity and Young Children, What Science Tells Us and Our Hearts Know. These are your wonderful authors, Zachary Stier and Tom Rendon. Thank you again. And for all of you watching, please make sure you visit our website at myedtech.life, myedtech.life, where you can check out this amazing episode and the other 319 wonderful episodes where I promise you, you will find a little something that you can sprinkle on to what you are already doing great. So please make sure that you visit our website. Make sure you follow us on all socials at My EdTech Life. And if you haven't done so yet, go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Give us a thumbs up, share our content. That way, all the algorithms can go ahead and put us out there to all of your friends too, and they can go ahead and like and share as well. And thank you to our wonderful sponsors, Book Creator. Thank you, as always, to Yellow Dig and Eduate for believing in our mission of bringing you some great conversations. bringing you some amazing resources, and of course, all for us to be able to grow in the education space. So thank you as always. And my friends, until next time, don't forget, stay techie.